I was in the 6th grade. That was the year I joined the school band, playing the clarinet. Honestly, I wanted to play the saxophone, the big, showy brass thing that got all the attention. But my grandfather had an old clarinet lying around. And that was that. I was stuck with it. That's 6th grade for you, carrying around an instrument you didn't choose yourself. Our band teacher was the middle-aged woman. And just as I did in the original piece, and also because I'm watching Bob's Burgers while writing this, I'm going to call her Miss Frond to protect her anonymity. At the time, I wasn't exactly popular. I was quite lonely, absent-minded, and always felt like an outsider. That meant I had a lot of extra remedial lessons after school. I spent hours in the empty band room, my clarinet practice echoing disjointedly in the stillness. But after a while, those extra sessions started taking a weird turn. Miss Frond began suggesting private tutoring sessions at her house. She'd say things like, "It's much quieter at my place," or "I can make you snacks," and "We can practice without any interruptions." And even in the 6th grade, that made me incredibly uncomfortable. It was a visceral feeling, a strange metallic taste in my throat, an intuitive warning bell that a kid couldn't quite articulate. But it was strong enough for me to adamantly refuse. The unsettling thing was that Miss Frond was relentlessly persistent. She suggested it, urged it, and reminded me about it at least once a week. It wasn't a casual invitation. It felt like a focused, deliberate effort to get me alone. It made me start feeling noticed in a bad way. That persistence eroded the little bit of trust I had. She was clearly crossing a boundary that a teacher shouldn't cross. Eventually, I decided to simply stop showing up for extra help. I figured it was better to be bad at the clarinet than to keep facing that suffocating discomfort. Things settled down for a while, thankfully, until one day, Miss Frond made an exciting announcement. Our band had been invited to march in the downtown Christmas parade. It was huge. Our school was only a year old, so this was a massive opportunity for publicity. And most importantly, the kids were thrilled. We were openly excited. We had extra rehearsals, and the school handled everything meticulously. Permits, uniforms, signs, everything was going perfectly, at least on the surface. And then, the day of the parade finally arrived. We gathered at the designated staging area. It was a big, grand event with hundreds of participants. And we, the young band from a brand new school, felt incredibly important. When our parents dropped us off, Miss Frond was very detailed and firm about where the parents would pick us up at the end of the road. She, along with a few parade organizers, was responsible for supervising us once the parents were gone. The parade began. We marched through downtown with our clarinets and flags. Everything went smoothly, at least as far as I could perceive. I was too stressed, terrified of hitting a wrong note, scared of falling out of step, to pay any attention to anything around me. I swear to God, a major car crash could have happened right in front of me, and I wouldn't have noticed. My mind was just a jumble of compliance and musical notes. When we finished and arrived at the designated pickup zone, the chaos began to subside. One by one, the kids were hugged and collected by their parents, the goodbyes loud and cheerful. I stood there, awkwardly holding my clarinet, and suddenly, I realized I was the last one left. There were no other kids, just me, Miss Frond, and a few people clearing away the barricades. The silence after the crowd noise was genuinely unnerving. It swallowed the area and made me feel terribly exposed. The instant the last kid disappeared from sight, and I'm sure Miss Frond orchestrated things subtly for this to happen, she immediately grabbed my arm. The grip wasn't gentle. It was firm and strong, unlike how a teacher touches a student. She flashed a strained smile, turned to me, and said, "You can call your mother from my house. My phone battery died." Then she started walking, practically power walking on. I and my clarinet were being dragged along. At that age, I had absolutely no idea how to handle this unexpected situation. Even though I had felt uncomfortable with her recently, the habit of compliance and respect for a teacher's authority was ingrained in me. I just followed without objection, despite my intuition screaming alarm. Looking back, the scene probably wouldn't have looked unusual to an outsider. She wasn't tall, and I was growing quickly in the 6th grade, so it wasn't like I was being visibly dragged or struggling. I kept up easily enough. I can't remember exactly where she was taking me, but it was clearly much further than where the parents were parked. The area was completely deserted. After a few minutes of this brisk walking, I saw her car, a dark SUV, blue-green, the kind everyone had in the late 90s, and it was the only car there. She headed straight for it, as if we were racing against a clock. I was only a few steps from the car door, and a genuine cold feeling started to engulf me. Things had gone too far, too fast. It was the exact moment things were about to spiral out of control, right as I was about to touch the dark door of that SUV, when suddenly I heard my name screamed from behind. It wasn't a normal call, but a sharp, compressed shriek, as if someone were running a race against death. I whipped my head around. It was my mother. She was breathless, her arms swinging, running for dear life toward us. Her face was contorted with a mixture of absolute anxiety and fury, an expression I had never seen before. My mother had never moved that fast in her life. Miss Fran's reactions was instantaneous. Her grip on my wrist tightened until it hurt, and she sped up. She tried to pull me faster toward the SUV door, as if locking that door would end everything and put me out of my mother's reach. That very reaction, that panic and urgency, is what betrayed her. It was the clearest evidence that something was deeply wrong. My mother lunged. I vividly remember the surge of adrenaline. She grabbed my shoulder, then yanked me forcefully away from Miss Fran's tightening hand. It was a decisive, almost violent move, as if she were pulling me out of a death trap. My mother didn't say a single word to the teacher. No question, no accusation, no explanation. Miss Fran's face was left with a fleeting look of shock and bitter defeat as she lost her grip on me. My mother immediately turned her back and hurried me toward her car. We drove home in a heavy silence. It was a silence unlike the usual quiet. It was the silence of shock. When we got home, my mother did something that utterly confused me. She started smothering me with affection. She held me tight, stroked my hair, repeatedly asking if I was okay. This was baffling, because most of the time, I was the near-forgotten child in the family dynamic, ignored 99% of the time. This sudden, intense attention emphasized the horror of what my mother knew had almost happened. I don't know exactly what took place. I don't understand why my mother was there at that exact moment, why she had to run, or why Miss Fran reacted like a cornered animal. And here is what haunts me. I never saw Miss Fran at school again, nor did I hear any news about her. She completely vanished, as if she had never existed on the teacher roster. I don't even know her real name to look her up. And the most terrifying thing is that my family never talked about it. Not once. The incident was buried under a thick layer of silence, a family secret no one dared to unearth. That silence is heavier and scarier than any explanation. It makes me wonder even now, what did my mother know that I didn't? Who tipped her off that I was the last one left? Had Miss Fran been under surveillance before? And was my mother already on alert? To this day, I still carry the confusion and the memory of the abandoned 6th grader in my head. I'm posting this because I genuinely needed to get it off my chest, and perhaps to hear other people's thoughts. Was it a blatant attempted abduction plot, or just a massive misunderstanding? Given Miss Fran's sudden disappearance and the absolute silence from my family, I think the answer is painfully clear. Our house, oh God, it was an absolute monster of old age. Enormous. A typical Victorian. Beautiful but horribly old. It had those relentlessly creaky floorboards and ceilings that were ridiculously, impossibly high, situated right in the middle of our university district. Normally, this house was a cauldron of chaos and noise. Since there were 8 of us living together, 8 loud, messy, perpetually broke students. When you have that many people, weird things happening is the default. Items go missing. The faint smell of smoke appears out of nowhere, or a door randomly locks itself. You could always blame the other 7. It was like an automatic system for eliminating responsibility. But then summer arrived, bringing with it the so-called Great Student Exodus. One by one, they packed up their cheap belongings and went home. For about a week now, the place that was once bustling with noise had sunk into a deep, echoing quiet. Only 3 people remained: me, my boyfriend, and one other housemate. This silence brought no peace. It brought a terrifying, sharp awareness. It was like listening to music, and then the radio suddenly switches to cold static. Now, when a glass clinked faintly or a floorboard groaned, there was no one else to blame. The other 7 no longer existed. It was this sudden demographic reduction that made me start to worry. The irrational suddenly became terrifyingly logical. I kept turning over the things that had been happening for months, things we had dismissed as student pranks or characteristics of an old house. Now, viewed through the lens of a nearly empty home, those things weren't funny anymore. They started coalescing into a single, terrifying hypothesis. Someone was living in our house who wasn't a paying tenant. An anonymous resident, an uninvited guest who had perhaps been with us all along, simply cleverly concealed within the crowd. I decided to list all the evidence, to organize this fear, only hoping I was wrong. But deep down, I knew I was right. Now I have to tell you about the first piece of evidence, the one that truly sent a chill down my spine. It was located right above my shower head, the attic hatch. Our bathroom, like everything else in this Victorian house, had horribly high ceilings. The hatch itself was a dark square, perched precariously high up, almost unreachable. You know, it was always an eerie detail, constantly suggesting a deep shadow. Since the day we moved in, this hatch had always been slightly ajar, as if it wasn't properly closed. I know for a fact it was open, because it drove my boyfriend insane. He would whisper to me every time he showered that he felt like something was looking down from the gap. We even joked that it was our 9th housemate. But then, it happened. Just this last week, after everyone had moved out, I noticed something was different. The tiny crack, the dark line I was used to seeing, was sealed shut, completely, without a gap. Folks, this is impossible. I'm only 5'2". There's no way I could reach it. My other housemate is also short. My boyfriend is taller, but he would definitely need a ladder or stacked chairs to get to it. And most importantly, that hatch was his personal obsession. I swear, he'd rather be struck by lightning than touch it. I asked both of them. They both denied it and looked at me with the exact same fear I was feeling. This attic hatch wasn't the automatic kind, or one that could be closed by the wind. It was old and heavy, requiring a distinct push or pull. The fact that it was closed was not random. It was a person's action. Someone had to climb up, and then decided that now was the time to close it. Did that person not want the light to leak in anymore? Or did he not want any eyes to be able to spot his presence from below? It felt like a declaration. I was here, but now, you are not allowed to see me anymore. It made me shudder with the sense of active surveillance. If the attic hatch was proof of where he was hiding, the tobacco incident was proof of how long he had been living here. In my house, 4 people smoked. So, seeing loose tobacco, rolling papers, and filters scattered around the living room or kitchen was normal. But for a very long time, since January, my boyfriend and I would find the same thing every morning when we came downstairs, some utterly shoddily rolled cigarettes lying abandoned. They were rolled, but they were crooked, loose, and left right next to the bag of tobacco. It was as if someone had tried to roll one, found it too terrible to smoke, and silently left it for us to see. At first, we just laughed. We had a housemate who only smoked when she was drunk, and she was terrible at rolling. We just assumed she was practicing stealthily at night, then got embarrassed by the result and hid it. We nicknamed them the mysterious tobacco worms and found the whole thing hilarious and perfectly logical. But then, that housemate moved out with the summer exodus. Her room was locked tight. And then, one morning after only the three of us remained, we still found a shoddily rolled cigarette, just as usual. That's when the laughter stopped. So, those cigarettes were not rolled by her. They were rolled by someone who was still here. Someone who didn't know how to roll, but had a consistent need to smoke. It definitely wasn't me, my boyfriend, or the other housemate. We were all proficient rollers. This hidden person, we realized, wasn't just a transient visitor. He was a long-term resident who had patiently been learning how to roll tobacco in the dark for months, and his nocturnal habit was exposed. This suggested that he had grown too comfortable, too confident living with us, using our supplies, and waited for the crowd to clear out to reveal himself. He had been there, right under our noses, since the beginning of winter. The shoddily rolled cigarettes were just weird, until this happened. This is when things turned from feeling merely pranked to feeling aggressively and disgustingly violated on a personal level. A few days prior, my boyfriend had bought me a giant spiral lollipop. The brightly colored, goofy kind. Just a small gift. One afternoon, he and I were standing in the kitchen, smoking. I placed the lollipop on top of the refrigerator, a high, very visible spot. When we were done, we left the kitchen and went upstairs to our room. A short while later, we came back down. Immediately, my eyes locked onto the refrigerator. My lollipop was still there, but right next to it was another shoddily rolled cigarette. But this one wasn't just badly rolled, it was half smoked. And the detail that made me want to scream was this. The cigarette had been extinguished right on the surface of the lollipop. At that moment, I wasn't just disgusted, I felt profoundly insulted. That was a gift from my boyfriend. There was absolutely no way either my boyfriend or I would do something so stupidly destructive. Extinguishing a cigarette butt on a personal item of food is an act of blatant contempt. Moreover, we were 100% sure that it was only the two of us in the house at that time, or rather, only should have been two people. This was no longer a clumsy joke. It was a message, delivered to us on an intensely personal level. The hidden person wasn't just living in our house. He had come downstairs, taken our tobacco, smoked it right there in the kitchen, and left his signature by extinguishing it directly on my gift. This meant he had been watching us long enough to know when we went upstairs, and immediately snuck down. He had proven he could move freely in our shared space. The feeling was like an invisible person had just tapped you on the shoulder, laughed at you, and disappeared. From that moment, the fear was no longer about a haunted house, but about a living person in hiding, an intruder who was observing our every move. It was terrifying. After the lollipop incident, I started noticing every little thing. Besides the signature evidence, there were smaller, seemingly less frightening things that only further confirmed someone was living with us. Take the trash cans. For example, our kitchen recycling bin was always a disastrous mess, student-style salsa. One day, my boyfriend and I returned from grocery shopping. We stopped dead in the kitchen. The bins were not just emptied, they were stacked up neatly and perfectly organized. Seriously, suspiciously neat. I can guarantee it wasn't us. And the one remaining housemate was too lazy to ever lift a finger for chores unless nagged. This suggested that our hidden resident wasn't just a vandal. He was also an orderly person who was probably bothered by our mess. And then there were the noises. This is what kept me awake. This Victorian house always had sounds. But now, in the silence of summer, those sounds became meaningful. We frequently heard clattering, very faint footsteps, and strange noises, like a water tap being quickly turned on and then off, or something being dragged across the floor, usually coming from the attic area or the upstairs hallway late at night. I always told myself, oh, it's an old house, or it must be the neighbors. But increasingly, they sounded like the movements of someone deliberately trying to be stealthy in the dark. And here is the detail that made everything absolutely chilling. I suddenly remembered a crucial piece of information we had completely forgotten. My boyfriend had lost his set of house keys a long time ago. We had searched everywhere, but couldn't find them. At the time, we just assumed it was absent-mindedness and had only changed the locks on our bedroom door. But we never changed the front door lock. Now, the truth hit me like a slap in the face. The intruder didn't break in or sneak through a window. He might have picked up those keys. Anyone who found them could easily figure out our address. Maybe an old student ID or a keyring tag was attached. That lost key had provided a legitimate entry point for the stranger. He wasn't just sneaking in. He could come and go as he pleased at any time, knowing he had perpetual access, while we remained completely oblivious. The feeling of being watched became more suffocating than ever. This story is about a guy named John, who I met while working in retail. You know, a dime-a-dozen service industry situation. But this quickly turned into something ripped straight from a bad horror movie. John was an older white guy, probably mid-$50s, and extremely well put together. He was the picture of a respectable, established gentleman, neatly dressed, polite when he spoke, with steel gray, shoulder-length hair tied back neatly in a low ponytail with a rubber band. The kind of person you'd expect to be closing multi-million-dollar deals at a bank, not browsing for livestock feed. At the time, I was working at a large farm and pet supply store. My workday was usually predictably dull, just the smell of hay and dusty aisles. Then the call came over the radio. A customer needed help in the electric fencing section. I was dispatched to help him find electric fencing and shock collars for dogs, something I personally detested. I was completely against using pain for training. But hey, it was my job. I walked up, plastered my fake customer service smile on my face, and asked how I could help. John didn't waste any time on small talk. He said he needed the electric fence because he had a cabin in the woods, and he wanted to make sure his dogs didn't wander off. Everything he said was calm, rational, until the very last sentence. He leaned down, his voice dropping into a gruesome whisper that made my entire body crawl. And then he said, "Oh, and by the way, I was thinking of using this shock collar. Maybe for you." I felt like the air had just been sucked out of the aisle. It was a joke, right? A sick, twisted joke aimed directly at me by a complete stranger. The comment was a chilling insult, a sudden, brutal reminder of the sexual violence always lurking beneath that polite facade. Utterly horrified, my mind raced, trying to find a way to retreat. I managed a weak laugh, the worst defensive reaction, and choked out a shaky, "No, thank you, sir." I finally managed to push him off onto another coworker who was better with technical specs. I used technical details as a shield. I thought, that's it. I deflected this creep, and I can go back to work. But of course, life isn't that simple. The terrifying truth about men like John is this. Rejection isn't a barrier. To him, it was a challenge. With John, that was the sign that the game had just begun. Only a few days later, John came back. You know that feeling when you see someone walk through the door and an unbidden chill runs down your spine? That's exactly what I felt when I spotted that steel gray hair, a feeling of being hunted. Even though I was standing amidst a massive display of merchandise and under the store's bright lights, I tried to slip away into the aisles, but he had the eyes of a vulture. He found me in the inventory section, where I was pretending to count boxes of cat litter. John walked right up, and there was no hint of an apology or embarrassment. He immediately escalated the harassment, from a vulgar comment to a direct threat of physical violence. He said, in a sharp, self-entitled, authoritative tone, "I came looking for you. I bought what I wanted. I don't know what you said, but I wanted to slap you the next time I saw you. Listen, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst." This wasn't a sudden, gross comment anymore. It was a blatant threat. In that moment, I thought he would dare. He actually thinks he has the right to put his hands on me. I had read too much about men who feel entitled to women in service roles, and how they resort to violence when rejected. But I couldn't let the fear take over. I looked him straight in the eyes. I even had to look up, and said firmly, without compromise, "If you touch me, I swear to God, I will hit you back." I forced the fear down my throat and fired back a warning shot. John's reaction? Odd. He didn't erupt in rage. Instead, I saw a flash of interest cross his eyes. It was as if my standing up to him had made him even more intrigued. A couple of days after that, he showed up again. This time, he tried to switch from intimidator to smooth talker in his twisted mind. He adopted a falsely sweet tone and said that he really wanted to take you out to lunch sometime. I refused politely, but firmly. I didn't want to create more conflict, but there was no way I was giving him an inch. I felt like I was walking a tightrope, trying to protect myself without provoking a lunatic. Having to deal with John wasn't just a fleeting annoyance. It was a terrible psychological burden. The store was no longer just my workplace. It had transformed into a hunting ground, where I was always on guard, constantly scanning the aisles and the parking lot. Every time the automatic doors opened, I felt a little clench in my stomach. He had completely destroyed the peace of my workday. The invitations and threats weren't the end of it. John began to turn his persistent advances into systematic stalking behavior. He would come into the store and overtly look for me. He seemed to have figured out my schedule, or at least the days I was guaranteed to be there. But thankfully, I usually saw him before he saw me. Spotting John had become a defensive reflex. A glimpse of that steel gray ponytail was the signal to immediately retreat into the break room, or a dead-end aisle in the stock area. On one particularly bad day, I saw him early on and had hidden well. I thought he had left after not finding me at the counter. I was in the back area, which we jokingly called the apartment. It was actually a tiny employee break room with a beat-up sofa and messy lockers. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking I was safe. But, unbelievably, he found me. John walked straight into the break room, a completely brazen act for a customer. He stood looming at the doorway, flashing that disgusting, smug smile, and said, "Just so you know, I didn't dress up for you today. I had a meeting with the bank, but otherwise, I would have asked you out for lunch." The comment wasn't meant to be comforting or explanatory. It only amplified the horror that he was tracking me and thinking about me even when preoccupied with his own professional life. Then, he stared at me in a profoundly scrutinizing way, as if analyzing an object, and delivered a terrible, invasive personal comment. "You know, I can tell you dyed your hair. You look beautiful, but that doesn't mean anything to you, does it? It could mean something if you reciprocated my feelings. That moment genuinely panicked me. He wasn't just a random harasser. He was a stalker, noticing my smallest physical changes. The feeling of being observed, analyzed, and having affection demanded of me completely crushed my personal space. The most horrific thing was the managerial neglect. John was never banned from the store, even after one of my managers overheard him saying these vile things to me. I don't know if it was store policy, fearing the loss of a moneyed customer, or just their sheer apathy, but it was clear that the workplace failed to protect me. My only saving grace was my coworkers. Thank God for them. They recognized the level of danger, and they became my personal warning and defense system. They would immediately signal when John walked in the door and help me disappear from his sight until he left. They were the only emotional and physical barrier between me and this obsessive man. In the end, I had to save myself. I quit my job. It was the only way to make John completely disappear from my daily life. I haven't seen him since the day I left, and I am profoundly, profoundly grateful. The story ends, but the lingering anxiety of always being on alert and the failure of management remain. It reminds me that sometimes the only escape from real-life horror is to run. I still remember clearly the day my sister called home to the family. Her voice. It wasn't just simple shock or anger, but a blend of both, which was rare for someone as composed as her. She and her best friend had been hiking in the Redwoods for about a week. You know, that massive, majestic, but utterly isolated forest. They were walking among the towering redwood trees, where the sunlight is practically swallowed, when a man appeared. My sister said he stepped out from nowhere, as if he had just materialized, and that detail alone was chilling enough. The most frightening thing, according to my sister, was that he looked completely normal. She even admitted he was quite handsome. No scraggly beard, decent clothes, not like someone who was lost or anything. But immediately, a cold, unexplainable, creepy vibe enveloped the air. It was like seeing a perfectly coiled, venomous snake in the sun. The normal appearance only amplified the horror. He started with extremely odd questions. Who are you two? And what the hell are you doing in his woods? My sister and her friend tried politely to explain they were just tourists, exploring. And that's when things shifted from strange to aggressive. He completely rejected their explanation. He became quickly irritated and said they were liars, dismissing everything they said with a terrifying certainty. My sister immediately thought, he must be high, and they decided they had to get out of there immediately, before things escalated any further. After being called liars, their initial confusion vanished, replaced by a sense of urgency. They had to leave immediately. They both started walking faster, hoping that by increasing their pace, they would create enough distance for this lunatic to turn back to his own path. But he didn't let up. He followed them, maintaining an uncomfortable proximity and continuing to drone on with bizarre comments. My sister said the feeling of being followed deep in the massive forest was terrifying, as if their personal space had been violently violated, and the isolation of the redwoods suddenly became a trap. The sound of his footsteps, echoing in the stillness of the trees, hammered at their nerves. Then he went beyond mere strangeness, shifting to harassment. He asked them to kiss because he knew they were lesbian lovers. Listen, that was sick and completely untrue. Neither of them is gay. He was clearly just projecting his own twisted fantasies onto them to justify this stalking and harassing behavior. That was the final straw. My sister's friend whirled around, all fear and patience gone, replaced by self-preservation anger. She screamed at him to get lost and leave them alone. My sister said, in that exact moment, things became absolutely terrifying. The man's face. It changed instantly. All the handsome or normal vanished. He was no longer just an odd man, but a predator showing his fangs. His face contorted, revealing a cold, pure anger, as if her friend had offended him in an unforgivable way. That was the transition moment from weirdo to lethal danger. My sister described it as the most evil and hateful look she had ever seen in her life. Not an outburst of rage, but a cold, calculated hostility, coming from a deep, sick place. He looked at them with utter revulsion, as if their mere existence was a terrible personal offense. That look lasted only a second, but it was enough to paralyze my sister, confirming that this man was far more than just a trail harasser. Then he spoke the words that could not be taken back, that turned a bizarre encounter into a life or death nightmare. He said it casually, as if talking about the weather. "You two are being disrespectful. I have killed a few people like you in the last few years, and I'd really love to add both of you to my tally. Do you understand? Add to my tally." He wasn't just threatening, he was boasting. He didn't see them as people, but as trophies, as numbers in a predator's scorecard. Hearing this in the middle of the desolate Redwoods, you realize he felt completely safe and absolutely entitled. He wasn't afraid of being caught. He felt he was in his own kingdom. It was a horrific confirmation that the chilling stories about serial predators lurking in the wilderness are real. His words were cold, clear, and utterly matter-of-fact. The fear level instantly shifted from anxiety to raw terror, where your only primal instinct screams, "Run." My sister and her friend didn't need to exchange glances or contemplate. There was no moment of hesitation. Following that threat, the only physical response was flight. They turned and ran for dear life, sprinting through the gigantic redwood trees and over the tangled roots, not daring to look back even once. That beautiful forest instantly became a terrifying maze, and horrifyingly, they heard him pursuing them. The heavy sound of his footsteps, the cracking of branches under his shoes, echoed through the air. He wasn't just running, he was screaming wildly behind them. My sister said she couldn't make out everything because fear had numbed her mind, but she distinctly heard him shouting chilling threats about chopping them both into pieces and other horrific vulgarities. It was the sound of a frustrated predator who had lost his composure and was now revealing sheer madness. They ran, running until their lungs felt like they would explode, but the adrenaline carried them through. Finally, luck was on their side. They burst out of the woods safely and thankfully didn't see him anywhere near the edge. When they dove into their car, every action was instinctive, locking the doors, starting the engine, and speeding away at top speed, not giving the small town a second glance. They drove straight to a safer location. The first thing they did was call the police and file a full report with all the terrifying details. After that, they didn't dare stay in the area for another minute. They left immediately, moving to another place, and would soon fly home. The immediate, raw fear was gone. But my anger and my sister's lingering trauma remain. A psychopath had turned the majestic redwoods into his hunting ground, and my sister and her friend were lucky enough to escape becoming the next numbers in his tally. Listen, the fact that I'm about to go camping in that same area again is what brought this memory back. An incident happened when I was about 10 or 11, and it's only now, just recently, that I've truly shuddered, realizing how terrifying it really was. My dad, the hero of my life, he would take me fishing and trekking almost every weekend as a way to help me get my mind right after a really bad incident had just happened. It was just the two of us then, always just us. We would blast the music super loud, roll all the windows down, and drive up into the mountains. I still remember the feeling of that day vividly. We parked near the lake edge, got out, and started unloading the gear. Then I helped my dad set up the fishing rods. But you know how it is. A 10-year-old kid can't stay patient waiting for a fish to bite for long. My eyes started wandering down to the water's edge, and I saw some frogs, tadpoles, that sort of thing. So I asked my dad, "Dad, can I go look for tadpoles?" My dad said, "Sure, but make sure you stay close by." Perfect. I was off. I had no idea that simple phrase, "stay close by," and my innocence was about to lead me right out of my dad's safe bubble and straight into a situation colder and scarier than anything beneath the lake's surface. I was a 10-year-old blonde girl, wearing a swimsuit, walking along the water's edge, my eyes glued to the lake. To most people, that sight would be unremarkable. But I was an early developer, with curves that I knew were already noticeable, an unfortunate fact, because it made me prematurely aware of the adult gaze. I knew to be wary of strangers. That was a basic lesson. But I was also a dumb kid, or at least too innocent. The sheer craving to find tadpoles overrode every alarm bell in my head. I was completely oblivious to my surroundings until a voice suddenly piped up, "Hey there!" I looked up. About 20 feet from the shore, there was a large rock jutting out of the lake, like a small island. On top of it, there were 3 or 4 guys sitting, and I saw 3 or 4 more people in the water surrounding it. I wasn't sure of the exact count, and I couldn't see the entire perimeter of the rock. Maybe there were even more that I missed. A coldness runs down my spine now as I recall their sheer number. They weren't 1 or 2 isolated campers. They were a group. Yet, my innocence acted as a fog. Perhaps because they looked around the same age as my older brothers. I wasn't alarmed at all. The truth is, I didn't care. I glanced at them, mumbled a perfunctory hello, and immediately went back to my task. Tadpoles were more important than anything. "Hi," I muttered, and bent down to the water. But they didn't stop. They began the kind of conversational bait predators use, seemingly innocuous, casual questions. They were trying to build rapport, a common ground. I don't recall all of it, but I distinctly remember the last question, the question that became their trap. Their conversation dragged on for a bit longer, the probing questions being tossed from the rock like harmless pebbles. But that was the strategy, grooming. They needed an anchor. I can't recall what they said immediately before, but I distinctly remember the turning point. One of them asked, in a casual, friendly tone, "Hey, what's your favorite kind of dog?" I answered, like an idiot, a kid daydreaming about her ideal pet. "I like Huskies," I blurted out. And that's when their voices changed, becoming too sweet, too accommodating. "Oh, cool. We've got a Husky at our cabin. Do you want to come meet him?" At the time, I didn't see anything odd about it. A dog. I looked up at them. I saw smiling faces. But now, looking back, I can feel the tension of that moment, as if an invisible rope was tightening. Husky. Cabin. Those were the perfect keywords to distract a 10-year-old girl. My salvation didn't come from fear. It came from a simple rule that was deeply ingrained in me. I had to ask my dad first. I didn't turn and run because I felt scared or victimized. I turned and walked away calmly because I knew I needed permission. I never went too far without telling him. That was my last protective wall, built from routine and trust in my father. "Yeah, let me go ask my dad first," I said innocently, and then I turned and walked off. I had no idea I had just walked away from a situation that could have ended my life. I returned to where my dad was fishing, with the innocent belief that I was about to meet a cute husky. I told him in a cheerful, carefree voice, "Dad, I just met some guys about my brother's age, and they said I could come to their cabin to meet their husky. Can I go?" My dad's reaction wasn't a gentle denial. It was an explosion. What the hell? No. He shot up instantly, an action that completely shattered the peaceful morning atmosphere. My dad wasn't just any regular father. He was an overprotective dad, but not without reason. This was the man who had once barreled through a set of double-paned glass doors just because I was missing. I had actually fallen asleep in the closet. This was the man who had stood between me and a bear. Not just once. His instinct was a terrifying thing. Even though I was disappointed, I didn't think anything was wrong. I thought, he probably just wants to talk to them, and I'll still get to see the dog. My dad started questioning me intensely. His voice strained, yet he remained frighteningly calm. He commanded, "Show me where you met them." I led him back to the rock. It was only a short walk, less than a minute. When we arrived, the spot was empty. The rock was bare, and the water was perfectly still. Not a ripple. All of them were gone. 3, 4, maybe 8 people vanished without a trace, without a sound or movement. I was confused. Where did they go? Dad? My dad didn't answer. The annoyance had left his face. It was a terrifying and cold focus. He didn't need to speak. Their too swift, too complete disappearance, as if they were just phantoms awaiting my consent, said it all. My dad told me I had to stay right by his side for the rest of the fishing trip. I thought it was punishment for bothering him. I didn't know I had just been locked back inside the circle of safety for life. I'm 28 years old now. Nearly 2 decades have passed since that fateful morning by the lake. For years, I recalled that story as a funny incident, a fond memory of the time my dad overreacted with his typical anxiety, and how I missed out on meeting a husky. I genuinely never thought anything was wrong. I truly believed my vigilant father was just being a little over the top. It wasn't until recently, when I started reading true crime stories about human traffickers' tactics, using pet dogs or kittens to lure children out of their parents' sight, that the cold realization truly hit me. This wasn't just a regular missing person incident. 8 men all vanished within a minute, after a 10-year-old girl said, "Let me go ask my dad first." That very disappearance was their confession. They knew that any adult intervention would have caused their entire plan to crumble. I suddenly realized I didn't just escape an awkward situation. I escaped a tragedy. I didn't follow them to the cabin, to a place where there was likely no husky at all. I didn't let them take me. The entire scenario, from their unusual number, to the probing question about the dog, and the alluring invitation, was all a carefully calculated tactic to separate me from my single protector. And the thing that saved my life, it wasn't extraordinary bravery or quick wit. It was just a basic habit, a boring rule that every child is taught. You have to ask your parents first. That old, simple rule, which was a minor annoyance of childhood, became my strongest shield. Now, every time I recall that empty rock, I know that is where I almost vanished forever, and I will be forever indebted to my overprotective father and that simple rule. This happened around 2006, maybe 2007, in rural upstate New York. My best friend, B, and I were sophomores in high school at the time. We'd known each other since 3rd grade and are still close now. We're both 27 years old. Let me give you a little background. B and I were inseparable. We spent so much time going back and forth between our houses that B's mom, Shelley, literally made the living room my own private room. I had my clothes, toys, and pictures there. Honestly, I was practically family. Pictures of B and me were hung everywhere. Shelley always wanted 2 daughters, and she loved me enough to treat me like her second child. Now, for the main part of the story, as I said, Shelley was divorced and often dated a few guys she met through sites like eHarmony. This was back in the early days of online dating. She had been talking to one guy for a couple of weeks, raving about how manly and charming he was. She was excited, and she always had an unwritten rule. Before she decided to go on an actual date, she had to show us the profile to get the daughter stamp of approval. One evening, she called us up to her room and showed us this man's profile. It was pretty basic, typical of a middle-aged man on eHarmony in 2007 dollars. But the headline, it made us pause, looking for a strong mother. That jarring capitalization gave off a weird vibe right from the start. He talked about his background in metalwork, his love for cold steel, and working in a foundry where he kept his icy heart just warm enough. I honestly said it sounded a little off, but I had to admit he was handsome. Dark, neatly combed hair, a beard, a strong jawline, icy blue eyes, and a decent physique for someone in his early $40s. I emphasized the creepy vibe and joked about how Shelley always managed to pick antisocial guys. We laughed, knowing she often brought home bizarre dating stories. But what could you expect from online dating? Finally, we told her, go for it. So they planned dinner. He had to drive 2 hours to our place, and then they would take one car into town. We helped Shelley pick out her dress, do her hair, and apply makeup. Once she was set, we went upstairs to give her some private time to prepare for a long night. We returned to B's room. We were painting a section of the wall, blasting music, just chatting away as we worked. A typical high school evening. Then suddenly, a cold sensation washed over us. The entire house was strangely silent. And then we heard it. A deep, gravelly voice right behind us. We jumped, our hearts slamming against our ribs. We let out a little scream of shock. A man was standing there. He had let himself into the house. No knock, no doorbell, not even the dogs barked. No sound at all. We had no idea when he had snuck into the house, or how long he had been standing right behind us, watching, before he spoke. And when he spoke, we trembled. His voice was low, guttural, like stone and gravel. Well, he said. I didn't know I was getting a 2-for-1 deal. He chuckled, a dry, hollow laugh. We stood frozen. He slowly advanced toward us, his steps casual, as if strolling through a park on a lazy afternoon. The heavy smell of old cigarettes filled the room, making the air thick and strange, as if Rod Serling himself were standing in the corner, ready to introduce our own episode of The Twilight Zone. That's when I noticed. Something was wrong. Up close, he didn't look like the man in the profile picture. His hair was salt and pepper, not jet black. And his eyes, they weren't icy blue like in the picture. They were completely black. Not dark brown, but pitch black, like two light-swallowing holes. The contrast between the clean photo and the thing standing before me chilled me to the bone. Then suddenly, Shelley screamed from downstairs. "Who's hurt?" She thought we were playing around again. She ran up the stairs and froze when she saw him standing between her and us. He turned immediately, opening his arms wide, and said in a less guttural tone, "Shelley, you look beautiful." I knocked, but no one answered. I hope it's okay that I let myself in. These are your girls. They're as beautiful as their mommy. The way he said mommy was sickening, like a private, dirty word. B and I glanced at each other. We didn't need to speak. We both felt it, the revulsion, the suffocating tension. Shelley looked at us over his shoulder, rolling her eyes, clearly not buying his excuse either. She led him downstairs. We heard him stammering apologies. We rushed to grab a phone. We had to warn her, to tell her what he'd said about the 2-for-1 deal. We hit send. 10 minutes later, Shelley came back upstairs. She closed the door. She hugged us, apologized for him scaring us, and said he told her we reminded him of his daughter. We nodded, but deep down, we knew something was wrong. She said they were about to leave. We hugged her, telling her to be careful. A few minutes later, we heard the front door. "Love you, tall girls," Shelley called. We yelled back. Then, the door slammed shut. He had succeeded. Now B's mom was out there, with a predator. A man with pitch-black eyes, who had spoken as if he'd already cast a strange, invisible net over her. Tuyệt vời. Đây là bản dịch câu chuyện của bạn sang tiếng Anh Mỹ, giữ giọng kể chuyện căng thẳng và tập trung vào sự leo thang của hành vi xâm phạm và áp lực tâm lý. The translation. We immediately started talking, our words tumbling out over each other. B practically screamed. He flipped the charming switch the second he saw Mom. And did you see his eyes? What the hell was that? He looked strikingly like the picture. But he wasn't that person, more like a warped version, a familiar face that had been twisted. We agreed on everything. His smell of stale cigarettes, his sneaking behavior, and his voice. He was exactly like a character straight out of a Dangerous Stranger PSA from the 90s. Again, we texted Shelley, making our horror clear. She reassured us, said things were fine, and promised to text a safety check every hour. But the thing that scared us most was that Shelley didn't seem panicked at all. It was as if he had cast some kind of spell over her. It was weird, but we only wanted the best for her. She texted consistently every hour, until the last one, about 5 hours after she left, which read simply, I'm okay, but officially freaked out and coming home now. Be home soon. Our anxiety immediately turned into raw terror. We paced the house until we saw headlights cut across the driveway. It had been an hour since that last text. We turned off all the lights, trying to peek through the side window. A truck barreled into the driveway. The passenger door swung open before the vehicle even fully stopped, and Shelley's feet hit the ground as fast as an athlete's. She waved the driver off, almost scrambling to the door, her eyes wide and frantic. She looked back and waved the truck away, house keys already in hand. She unlocked the door and slid quickly inside the safety of the house. Turn off the lights. Upstairs, Shelley ordered. She locked both deadbolts and threw the chain lock on, without even glancing at us. We followed her up to B's room and looked down through the window. The truck was still sitting there, headlights on, engine running, with no intention of leaving. All three of us stared at the truck in the dark, and Shelley started pouring out the entire nightmare. In short, he had booked the wrong restaurant. Then, he suggested they get food and have a picnic. Shelley, a woman who worked in an office, didn't like the outdoors, so she declined. He followed up with a manipulative line. I drove 2 hours to get here. You kind of owe me. Shelley said she felt guilty. So, when he said he had a vacation home nearby in Bethel, New York, only about 35 minutes from our town, she agreed to let him cook. When they got there, to a decent-looking log cabin, he started saying disgusting things. He kept mentioning how easy it would be to take her alone. He also repeated that he liked strong mommies, because they put up a fight, but she had given up. This sent shivers down Shelley's spine. This wasn't the man she thought she was meeting, nor the one in the picture. Shelley began to realize the truth. Then, she feigned sickness and demanded to be taken home. He wasn't happy, but he stopped cooking and started rummaging in his pockets for his keys. Then, he changed the subject, starting to ask about our girls, meaning us. This freaked Shelley out so much that she said she would call family to pick her up if he didn't find the keys immediately. Frighteningly, he found them right away. When they got outside, his truck wouldn't start, so they had to switch to his work truck. Shelley was shaking so badly that she couldn't take her eyes off the truck parked in the driveway as she told the story. He said they had to walk around the back of the house to the garage where the work vehicle was, which is the exact truck we were now staring at. It smelled like bleach and metal, Shelley whispered, her voice husky. The smell permeated the whole cab. On the way back, he wouldn't stop asking about us. What did the girls do that she was displeased with? What faults caused them to be spanked? What mischief did they do? How would she manage without them? And the final, most terrifying question, the one that would chill any parent to the bone. Would she sacrifice herself for our girls? Shelley looked at him, stunned, unable to believe her ears. He just laughed. She grew increasingly scared as she observed the truck bed. There were things she thought were chains in a bucket. A workbench drilled into the floor of the truck, a duffel bag, and very large metal objects she didn't dare ask about. It was just as he was bragging about the stolen photos that they drove into the driveway. Shelley had endured enough. She was almost done recounting. But the true horror was not over yet. We were still standing in the dark, paralyzed with fear, when the truck parked outside abruptly turned off its headlights. That was a clear signal. Shelley didn't waste a second. She immediately picked up the phone and called the sheriff, urgently stating that an unwelcome person was parked outside her house. Fortunately, this was a small town. The sheriff was not only a classmate who graduated with Shelley, but he also lived just 3 houses down from us. The moment we saw the man step out of the truck, carrying that suspicious duffel bag, the sheriff's patrol car came screaming up and blocked him in immediately. He panicked, reacting in absolute frenzy. He literally hurled the duffel bag back into the truck cab and tried to ram the sheriff to clear an escape path. When he realized he was completely blocked from behind, he didn't hesitate to drive straight across the front lawn. We couldn't believe our eyes. The truck roared, tearing up a huge patch of the grass, and vanished into the darkness. The sheriff came to the door immediately, checked if we were okay, and reassured us that he had units waiting for him at the end of the road to box the guy in. The 3 of us hugged each other, sobbing uncontrollably, releasing the sheer terror we had just endured and relieved to be safe. However, despite the escape, the incident left a deep mental scar. For weeks afterward, we lived in persistent paranoia. How long had he been inside our house? Did he manage to plant hidden cameras somewhere? Did he put something in the food in the kitchen to harm people? Though it was terrible, we managed to cope. We never heard anything about him being caught. But afterward, we did occasionally receive strange, chilling Facebook messages. There were 2 messages that we were absolutely certain came from him. After about 3 months since the incident, the last message was sent, and after that, there was complete silence. 11 years have passed since that terrifying night, but whenever we get the chance, we still recount the story. The rain that day wasn't just rain. It was a wall of water, thick and gray, swallowing everything and reducing my world to just a few feet of slick, wet asphalt ahead of me. I was 18 and soaked to the bone. This was before cell phones, an era where if you got into trouble, you could only rely on a phone call from a public booth or the kindness of strangers. I was walking an incredibly long way home after pulling a double shift at the diner, and the utter exhaustion had seeped into my core. A lone small-town girl, all I dreamed of was collapsing into bed. Common sense dictates you never hitchhike. I knew that well. But every step was torture, and the simple, cruel math in my head between physical pain and a potential threat led me to make a stupid decision. An old sedan, riddled with rust, looking like it hadn't been inspected in a decade, slowly rolled up. The driver was an elderly man, thinning gray hair, his face deeply etched with wrinkles, but his eyes held an unexpectedly sincere look of concern, and that disarmed my defenses. And then I saw it, the thing that completely extinguished my doubts, my false security blanket, a large, worn Bible resting neatly on the back seat. A man of God, I told myself. He must be safe. He had to get out to open the door for me, and every one of his movements was slow, labored. He walked with a limp, clearly favoring an injured leg, and the entire process was awkwardly prolonged. Once I was settled on the cracked vinyl seat. He leaned in, his breath warm and humid, a stark contrast to the cold in the car. "Well, now," he said. "You ought to know this door won't open from the inside. The latch is broken? Don't worry, though. I'll open it for you when we get there." A primal, freezing terror tightened in my stomach. My only way out was completely in his hands. Every cell in my body screamed, "Get out, now." But then another voice cut in, the one trained over years to be a good girl, the inherent fear of being a nuisance or being rude. He went to all that trouble with his bad leg to help me. It whispered, "Don't be ungrateful. Don't reject a kindness." And so, I stayed put, sealing myself into that rolling iron cage. The sound of the rain drumming on the roof was like a drumbeat of despair, and for the first time, I felt the crushing weight of fear closing in. The car engine kept sputtering and coughing, a strange, anxious sound that exactly matched the creeping unease in my chest. Initially, the conversation was quite normal, revolving around the weather and the long shifts at the diner. His voice was genuinely soft, warm, like a grandfather's, almost making me believe my initial paranoia was baseless. He was polite, perhaps overly so, complimenting my uniform, and even the neatness of my hair despite the rain. But then, everything began to change. He started looking at me with a peculiar intensity that wasn't admiration, but rather scrutiny, assessment. The corners of his eyes crinkled into a smile that held no actual joy for me. Then he told me I looked exactly like his late wife. "It's unbelievable, simply unbelievable," he murmured, his voice thick with a sense of lingering nostalgia. He went on to say that her spirit must have guided him, leading him to me in the middle of this pouring rain, so he could help me get home. The way he told it sounded sweet, like a romantic belief in destiny. But that sweetness quickly twisted into something bizarre and chilling. The compliments became increasingly specific, shifting from my appearance to my circumstances. He started asking if I was still in school, what my hobbies were, questions a truly concerned person might ask. But the way he asked them felt more like checking boxes, a screening process rather than genuine curiosity. He was slowly, meticulously building a profile of me, evaluating my life and my availability. The atmosphere in the car, which had started as merely awkward, was now becoming heavy, suffocating, like before a storm. I tried to laugh loudly at his dull jokes, trying to project a sense of normalcy when I felt anything but. I was desperately trying to send a signal that I wasn't a victim, that I had a family, a life of my own, but his gaze only intensified, fixed on me with the certainty of someone who believed he had just rediscovered a lost treasure. Right then, I knew that my initial fear wasn't paranoia at all. It was a warning. The conversation abruptly swerved, a turn without brakes, straight into the most private and darkest corners. One second we were talking about my favorite subject in school. The next, he was leaning closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, and he asked me a question so invasive and grotesque that it stole my breath away. He asked me if I was on my period. My mind spun, trying to process the blatant violation. A wave of anger and sheer panic surged through me, but he acted as if it were only a slightly curious, mildly inappropriate question, about to lead to some harmless, vulgar joke. Instinctively, the good girl defense mechanism kicked in. I tried to force a smile, asking, as gently as I could, "Why would you want to know that, sir?" My attempt to turn the situation into a ridiculous joke failed miserably. He didn't laugh. There was no punchline. He just looked straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel, and said with a chilling calmness, every word dropping into my stomach like cold stones, "Because, if you are in your fertile window, we should start trying to conceive immediately." The world outside the window stopped. Oh, my God. The fear was no longer cold. It was hot and paralyzing. The harsh reality hit. This wasn't a kind, concerned widower. This was a man who believed he had just found a replacement for his dead wife, and I was stuck in a broken car with an inoperable door. He continued, his voice now a terrifyingly flat monotone, laced with his warped religious conviction. God had left him alone for years, but now I looked exactly like his late wife, and it was clearly my destiny to belong to him. He had given himself a divine mission to restart his life and finally have the big family his previous wife couldn't give him. In his eyes, I wasn't a person. I was just a vessel, a second chance bestowed by some supernatural power. Horror was no longer just a feeling. It had become something solid, something with weight. A stone pressing down on my chest as he began to assert the claim he believed he had over me. Slowly, deliberately, he reached across and took my cold, trembling hand in his own rough, calloused grip. Then he brought it to his lips. He kissed it, an act of devotion so revolting it made my skin crawl. "I can't wait to show you our new bed," he whispered. The words were both a promise and a threat. That calmness in his tone, the quiet leap from small talk to abduction, to forced affection, hit me like a bucket of ice water to the face. My brain finally snapped out of its frozen shock. I had to get out. I started with a desperate lie, scrambling for something, anything, that might make sense. I told him I'd just remembered leaving something important at work. My bag, my keys, whatever could make him turn the car around. He brushed it off with a wave, utterly unmoved. "You can get it tomorrow," he said, firm and final. I tried again. This time, I went for something primal. I told him I needed to use the restroom, badly. "You can hold it until we get home," he replied, his voice flat, emotionless. No argument, no negotiation, just a quiet declaration of an unchangeable fact. He wasn't going to let me out. I was trapped, locked inside a moving cage with a man who thought I was the answer to his prayers. Then the conversations twisted into something worse, a grotesque attempt at normalcy. He began to ramble about how things were different back in the day, about rigid gender roles, how men were the pillars of the household, and women were given by God to serve their fathers and husbands. He quoted scripture to justify every rotten, woman-hating belief he held. He was setting the rules for my new life. He even talked about his own wedding day, recalling the sacred moment his wife was given to him by her father. Every word out of his mouth drove one truth deeper into my skull. This man wasn't just infatuated with me. He was preparing to own me forever, and he was using a hollow frame of religion to make it all seem righteous. My rational pleas had failed. I realized then there was only one path left. I would have to fight him, in his own language. My mind, running at full throttle in sheer desperation, latched onto the one loose thread in the holy facade he'd wrapped himself in, his obsession with being seen as a righteous man. He had just finished bragging about his wedding day, about how his father-in-law had given him his bride, a clear sign that tradition and ceremony meant more to him than my safety ever could. And so, the words tumbled out of me, a desperate gamble, stitched together from fear and half-remembered fragments of dull church sermons. "Wait," I blurted, forcing my voice to sound worried, pious even, instead of panicked. You'll have to ask my father's permission to marry me before we go home, right? That's what God would want, isn't it?" I pressed harder, wrapping my fear in scripture. "You have to do that. Because if we don't, we'll be living in sin, and our marriage bed won't be sacred anymore." I'd struck him with his own weapons, words forged from the very faith he used to justify his madness. Words meant to pierce the mind of a man enslaved by his own Bible-born delusions. He didn't see it coming. His face darkened, a flicker of real anger flashing in his eyes. His pride stung. "I know the Bible better than you, young lady," he snapped. the mask of calm predator slipping for just a heartbeat. But then, irritation twisted into something else, a defensive kind of agreement. Of course I'll ask your father's permission. I'm a man of God. He'd taken the bait. I seized the moment, still playing the part of the devout, trembling believer. I told him gently, almost reverently, that we couldn't possibly begin our life together in sin, and that a truly holy man would know he must visit my parents first to do things the proper way. I even added, with a nervous, breathless little laugh, that my street wasn't far at all. I told him that calling on my parents first, even if it wasn't yet a formal proposal, was exactly what a godly man would do. His chest swelled, his pride soothed by my supposed respect for his devotion, and at last he agreed. The cage hadn't opened, but the bars had begun to bend. As we turned onto the street I'd pointed out earlier, my heart pounded against my ribs like a frantic drum. Everything, every shred of my plan hinged on this moment. He slowed the car, scanning the quiet houses. "Which one's your parents' place?" he asked. I pointed to a random house, a good distance from my actual apartment, where I lived alone. I made sure we drove right past it. The trick was to keep the act going until that damn door opened. He wanted to go in immediately. "No, I'll meet them right now," he insisted. I stopped him with a desperate lie, words spilling out faster than I could think. "Oh, no, sir. I need to warn them first. I have to prepare them for the miracle God sent me. It'll take them a few days to be ready for such a holy surprise. Please, come back tomorrow." His eyes narrowed. He saw straight through the thin excuse. "I'll give you a few minutes to talk to them," he said, voice hard and final. "But then we're leaving." The door of opportunity was slamming shut. I had one chance left. I looked at him with all the trembling sincerity I could summon, eyes brimming with tears, and whispered, "I need time to pack my things. Everything I own is here. Please, just drive around the block. Give me a moment." He hesitated. A long, dreadful pause. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel, weighing risk against reward. The risk of waiting, the reward of possession. Finally, reluctantly, he nodded. He reached across, and with a heavy click, the door unlocked. I didn't step out. I flew. I bolted up the stranger's porch steps, turned, and waved a frantic, performative gesture until his car rolled away, slow and steady, disappearing around the corner. The instant he was gone, I spun around and ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, sprinting down the street, lungs on fire, every heartbeat screaming one word: run. When I reached my building, I slammed the door shut, locked it twice, and, shaking uncontrollably, dragged the heavy old couch across the floor to wedge it against the door. I never saw him again. I didn't call the police that night. The shock and the adrenaline had swallowed my judgment whole, a decision I regret to this day. But that night changed me forever. A few days later, I moved in with my boyfriend. I became obsessed with safety, waiting at work every night until he came to pick me up, and never, ever walking alone in the dark again. When most people think about delivery work, they picture busy city streets or quiet suburban neighborhoods. But my job is different. I work for a major shipping company down south, and my route takes me deep into the countryside, through rolling hills and thick forests where the air always feels damp and heavy. After years on the job, I've come to understand that back roads mean something very different to me than they do to anyone else, and I was used to it. The folks out here are, for the most part, incredibly kind. The kind of small-town warmth that makes you feel safe, even when you're 30 miles from the nearest gas station. Sure, sometimes you get those driveways so steep you have to pray your transmission doesn't give out. Or those so-called roads that are really just two muddy tire ruts carved into the dirt. But I'd come to see that as part of the charm, the flavor of the job. Everything was fine until last year. That's when I got reassigned to a new route, one that took me even deeper into the middle of nowhere. It started out like any other day, along a long gravel stretch dotted with a few scattered houses. I drove on autopilot, half aware, just focused on getting packages out on time. Roads like that were a dime a dozen out here. But then I reached the address, and the GPS was pointing to a place that seemed to defy every rule of delivery. No mailbox, no driveway, gravel or concrete, not even a real road, just a faint mark on the ground, a barely visible path that might have seen tires roll over it a few times, though it looked more like a deer trail than anything meant for a delivery truck. The driveway stretched about 250 yards, ending at a house that was almost completely swallowed by the trees. The problem wasn't the distance. It was the terrain. Out here, once you turned off the main road, you never knew what you were getting into. Hidden ravines, washed out edges, sudden drop-offs. I was driving a full-sized box truck, heavy as hell. One wrong move, one tire too close to the edge, and that thing would tip. And if that happened, insurance would be the least of my worries. So I slowed the beast down to barely a crawl, less than a mile per hour, and inched forward, foot by trembling foot. Every inch of that road felt like I was driving on a razor's edge. As I crept closer to the house, my eyes kept darting around, scanning everything. I passed an old, rusted-out pickup truck, half buried in the dirt and weeds. Nothing unusual. You see a lot of that out here. But the deeper I went, the more the details began to shift, from the usual rural clutter to something quietly, deeply wrong. I started noticing them. 4 massive satellite dishes. Not one. 4. Each one positioned at perfect intervals among the trees, all aimed skyward like silent metal sentinels. They were the old kind, huge, outdated, the kind that should have been scrapped decades ago. Why 4? Why not a single modern dish on the roof like everyone else? A chill slid down my spine. This house was isolated, yes, but whoever lived here seemed desperate to stay connected. Or maybe, to listen. Maybe they wanted to receive everything that came through the air. And as that thought took shape, half paranoid, half instinct, something deep in my gut twisted tight. Out there, in the thick, wet silence of the woods, I realized I wasn't just delivering a package. I was driving into something I didn't understand. Finally, after crawling what felt like a mile down that narrow trail, I reached the end. And as I pulled up to the house, I realized those 4 satellite dishes were nothing compared to what stood before me. The place looked like it had been ripped straight out of a horror movie. It was a cabin, not the cozy, rustic kind you'd rent for a weekend getaway. No, this was a shack, leaning and half collapsed. The kind of place that looked like it had been forgotten by time itself. If you've ever seen the final episode of Breaking Bad, it looked exactly like the cabin Walter White hid in, small, sun-bleached, and barely holding itself together. I parked my hulking delivery truck as close as I could get, shut off the engine, and just sat there for a moment, letting the silence of the woods settle around me. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It pressed on me, heavy and dense, like the air itself was watching. After a long, tense minute, I forced myself to breathe. I had a job to do. Get in, drop the package, get out. It was a small delivery, something that fit in a padded envelope. I grabbed it, stepped out, and walked toward the door. That's when I noticed the next detail, one that sent a sharp, cold ripple through my chest. The front door had a large, rectangular window. Not the kind of double-pane glass you see in modern homes, but that old, thin, slightly warped kind, the kind you find in buildings from the 50s that have never been renovated. It didn't offer privacy so much as it hinted at it, like looking through a sheet of cloudy ice. As I crouched to set the small package, whatever it was the resident had ordered, onto the warped wooden porch, I couldn't help but glance inside through that window. The room, the main room, I guessed, was completely empty. Not sparse. Empty. No couch, no TV, no rug, no decorations, no coffee table, not even dust bunnies, and it was just a bare wooden box. Clean, sterile, wrong. And in the middle of that hollow space were two metal folding chairs, both open, both facing the same corner, a corner where there was nothing but bare planks and a film of old dirt. My hands kept working automatically, scanning the package, confirming delivery, but my mind was screaming. Why two chairs? Why facing the corner? It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a stage, set for a single, silent, horrifying performance that I had no business interrupting. I found myself glancing inside again, quick and nervous. From what I could see beyond that first room, the rest of the cabin looked the same, empty. Maybe there was an old stove in the kitchen, covered in grease. But I didn't look long enough to care. That sixth sense, the one that's kept me alive through years of lonely back roads, slammed into overdrive. And my brain, cold and certain, whispered one clear verdict. Something's wrong. You need to leave. Now. The simplicity of it, the two chairs facing a corner in an otherwise empty room, was more horrifying than any blood or chaos could ever be. It spoke of control, of waiting, of an order that had nothing to do with human life. The instant my scanner let out that dry, mechanical beep, confirming the delivery, every nerve in my body went into red alert. Survival mode, fully engaged, and I turned on my heel and started back toward the truck, maybe 30 feet away. I didn't run. I forced myself not to. Every muscle in my body screamed to sprint, but I made myself walk, steady, normal, each step stretched tight like a wire ready to snap. The first conscious thing I did, pure instinct, was rip my hoodie down and yank off my cap. I needed my full field of vision, every inch of it. I needed to see everything in my periphery, every flicker between the trees. The forest was no longer silent. It was alive with shifting shadows and the pounding echo of my own heartbeat filling the air. My eyes darted everywhere, desperate for some sign of normalcy, or a way out. Where was the nearest neighbor? I spotted a small shed up the hill, windowless, leaning to one side. But the way it sat there, rooted in the same dirt, part of the same property, made my stomach twist. A storage shed? A workshop? Or maybe, in the paranoia boiling through my skull, something worse. A watch post. A lookout. I knew I was spiraling, letting my mind scare itself to death. But the image of those two chairs wouldn't leave me. It sat in my chest like ice. As I walked, trying to keep my pace calm and even, I felt it. Not with my eyes, not with my ears, with something deeper. The sensation of being watched, heavy, focused, predatory. It was like a pressure on my spine, a weight that grew with every step toward the truck. Each footfall brought that unseen gaze closer, like a giant invisible hand pressing down on me, holding me in its crosshairs. It's that moment when you know you're not alone anymore. When something out there, something patient, is waiting, watching, and it knows you haven't realized it yet. That's the kind of attention only a predator gives its prey. I reached the truck and practically threw myself into the driver's seat. The roar of the engine coming to life was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and hit the power lock twice, just to hear that second click. Then I did something I'd never done in my entire career. I checked the cargo hold. I twisted in my seat, staring through the rearview mirror, then turned fully around, eyes locked on the dark, cavernous space behind me, making sure that no one, nothing, had climbed in. I was shaking, hard. What the hell was this place? The whole property felt like a perfectly laid trap, and I just walked right into it, delivered its supplies. Now I had to find a way to escape. Getting in had been bad enough. But now, I had to back out of that narrow trail the entire way, completely blind, guided only by raw, animal fears. That path, the 250-yard stretch of twisting, uneven dirt, now felt like a mile of cliffside road. I threw the truck into reverse and began backing out, inch by inch, my neck whipping side to side as I scanned everything around me. The trees, the shack, the shed up on the hill, the rusted-out pickup. I was braced, ready to see someone step out from the tree line, or worse, from that empty corner inside the cabin. But nothing moved. The pressure of silence returned, thick, suffocating, and waiting. The only sounds were the protesting groans of the truck's frame and the tires grinding against loose gravel. Finally, mercifully, I reached the main gravel road. I slammed it into drive and hit the gas. My heartbeat slowed from a sprint to a desperate jog as I put distance between me and that place. I'd only made it maybe 40 feet past the property's overgrown entrance, the dark, tree-choked mouth of that nightmare, when I saw something lying across the road. A large black trash bag, heavy-duty, right in the middle of the empty gravel lane. Its mouth was open, just slightly, as if it had been dropped in a hurry or never tied shut. Instinctively, I eased off the gas, eyes locked on it through the windshield. The gap was wide enough for me to catch a glimpse of what was inside, a flash of color, texture. It looked like fabrics, soft, feminine, a sweater, maybe, a blouse, something light-colored and wrinkled, shoved inside. But it was wrong. That kind of thing didn't belong here, not in a garbage bag, not in the middle of a lonely country road, and definitely not outside that property. The sight hit me like the gut punch, dragging every ounce of dread from that empty room back to the surface. Only this time, it was real. Was that a kill room? The thought came fully formed, cold and absolute. Was someone, multiple someones, being held captive there? Were those two chairs facing the corner meant for them? All the fragments snapped into place, the isolation, the 4 satellite dishes, the hollow cabin, the 2 waiting chairs, and now this, a garbage bag with something humanly intimate inside. It all fused together into one coherent, horrific picture. Something evil had happened out there, and I had just driven straight through the edge of it. I grabbed my phone and called a buddy, another rural route driver, a guy who understood how weird these back roads could get. I told him everything, every detail, my voice trembling the whole time. He didn't laugh. He didn't brush it off. "Dude," he said, calm but firm, "go back and take some pictures. Don't get out. Just get evidence, son." I hesitated, but I knew he was right. If I didn't, I'd regret it forever. So I checked my mirrors, turned the truck around, and headed back. Maybe 5 minutes had passed, less, even. I drove faster this time, eyes locked on the exact spot where the trash bag had been. And then, my blood went cold. The bag was gone. The road was empty, completely empty. I slowed to a crawl, scanning the ground, the ditches, the underbrush on both sides. Nothing. No scraps. No torn plastic. No trace. It had been removed, faster than I could turn around. Not the sign of a mistake. The sign of someone watching, someone alert, and someone ready to act. The instant I was out of sight, the brutal truth about that missing trash bag hit me harder than anything else. Not the empty room, not the feeling of being watched. It was that. Someone had seen me. Someone had been watching the entire time. And the moment I drove away, they moved with precision, speed, and purpose. They realized they'd made a mistake leaving the bag out there. They knew I might turn back, or that someone else might, which meant one thing: they had eyes on the road. The realization slammed into me like ice water, dragging up an old, twisted thought I'd buried years ago. A sick little daydream I used to have when I first started this job. I'd always known we never really know what's in the boxes we deliver, or who we're delivering them to. But sometimes, just sometimes, I'd wonder, What if someone's holding people hostage inside a house somewhere, ordering everything they need online, food, soap, tools, so they never have to leave their prisoners alone? That morbid little scenario was all I could think about when I dropped that package at the cabin. I was the courier for something I didn't understand, the last link in a chain that fed something secret and malicious. I quit that delivery job less than a week later. The official story was different. I said I was switching fields, looking for better hours. But the truth was simpler. That address broke something in me. Every dirt road, every patch of woods, every flicker of movement in my rearview mirror reminded me of those 2 empty chairs and the invisible weight pressing between my shoulder blades. I told my supervisor everything, every detail. He said he'd contact local law enforcement right away, have that address flagged as a do not deliver location. I never heard another word about it. And I know, if the police had gone there and found anything, if they'd uncovered evidence, or God forbid, people being held captive, I would have been called immediately as a key witness. The phone never rang, so I can only assume one of 2 things happened. Either the cops went there and found nothing, because whoever lived there had time to clean up, or my report ended up buried in some drawer, dismissed as the rambling of a stressed-out rural driver. But the pristine emptiness of that cabin doesn't make it less real. If anything, it makes it worse. It makes me wonder about the bag. Did they realize their mistake the second I left? Did the sight of my truck lingering on the main road tip them off? Did they have someone waiting, ready to remove the only physical trace I'd seen? I'll never know. I don't even remember the exact route anymore. It was deep in the system, buried in a string of coordinates, a line of code, and in my memory, it exists only as a ghost. But I think about it a lot. Sometimes I'll be sitting at a stoplight or scrolling through my phone, and the image of that empty room flashes through my mind, the air thick, the silence heavy, and the sense that something was still sitting in that corner, waiting. And every time it happens, I shiver, because the most terrifying thing isn't what I saw that day. It's what I delivered, and to who, and I don't think I'll ever want to know the answer. At first, it all felt like the start of some lighthearted rom-com. You know, I was a student at this small but well-regarded university. The kind of place where you just assume everyone's decent, trustworthy, a little bit smarter than average. Alex, the guy, was over-text, impossibly charming, witty, sweet. That kind of effortless flirt you almost can't help but like. And I even had references. 2 of my close friends knew him, said he was the funny guy in their class. So, every social signal flashed green. I felt safe enough to say yes to a first date, a casual little picnic at 6 p.m. It sounded harmless, fun. I told myself, come on, it's just a guy from campus. What could go wrong? That illusion of safety started to crack before he even showed up. 6 o'clock came and went. 7 o'clock came and went. By 7:45, I was sitting there with a basket of food gone cold, feeling like an idiot. Then, at exactly 8, a text. Not an apology, not even an explanation, just a short, flat message. Running late. Let's do 8:30. I was furious, so disrespectful, but I had already invested too much time and energy to just bail. So I sighed, told myself to chill, and agreed. When he finally showed up, he tossed out some half-baked excuse I didn't even register. The picnic? Scrapped. Instead, he gestured toward his car and said we'd grab something to eat. That's when the first alarm bell went off. He didn't drive toward any restaurant. He drove straight to his apartment complex. Immediately, my stomach dropped. It was late. The setting had shifted from public to private, and every instinct I had told me this wasn't right, but I silenced it. Don't be dramatic, I told myself. Your friends know him. He's fine. So I went in, hesitant, smiling, pretending everything was normal, because I didn't want to seem uptight or ruin the night. The moment the door closed behind me, I knew I'd made a huge mistake. It was a multi-bedroom apartment. He lived there alone, and it was lit by a single flickering candle and one dim floor lamp in the corner. Not romantic, not cozy, just wrong. The shadows pooled in the corners. The air felt still, thick. The space seemed bigger than it should have been, swallowing up sound. He set out some food, and as we talked, the atmosphere tightened, like invisible hands wrapping around my chest. Alex didn't seem like the guy from his messages anymore. He was jittery, almost performing, like he was trying to act normal but didn't quite know how. I forced small talk, grasping at anything to keep it casual, while my brain focused on one thing only. This place is too dark, and every light switch, every exit, is on his side of the room. His restlessness didn't ease. In fact, it only highlighted something cold and unfathomable beneath the surface. He kept glancing around, tapping his fingers on the table, and I felt like I was watching a bad actor fumble through a role. The first half hour passed with awkward, forced small talk, both of us trying to manufacture a connection we both knew wasn't there. And then, without any real transition, he shifted completely. His voice dropped, lower, almost a whisper in that dim room. He looked straight at me, and the anxiousness drained from his face. In its place was a blade-sharp stare, probing, clinical, that ran a chill down my spine. He asked, "Hey, let's talk about our darkest secrets. Have you ever really thought about killing someone?" The shock nearly stopped my breath. What the hell? That is not a question that belongs on any date. It felt deliberate, like a test to probe my boundaries and reactions. I forced myself to look calm and answered clearly, "No, absolutely not." He was quiet for a beat, as if analyzing my response. Then he launched into a story so outlandish, I couldn't tell if he was trying to frighten me or impress me. He claimed he'd been in the Navy, and during a mission he'd bombed a ship and accidentally killed 5 people. He recited it in a flat, even tone. No remorse, no grief, utterly hollow. It didn't read as a real confession so much as a practice performance meant to intimidate. It was absurd, impossible for a college kid, but it amplified the wrongness. He was painting himself as someone capable of real violence. While I struggled to figure out how to react, whether to show horror, skepticism, or simply try to end the conversation, he changed tack again. He gave a half smile, almost empty, and said the Navy story was a joke, a fabrication. His attempt to smooth it over barely registered relief, because immediately after, he confessed the real thing. "But I have seriously thought about killing someone," he said without hesitation. His voice went cold when he named the target, his ex's current boyfriend. That's when my anxiety hardened into absolute terror. The Navy story might have been a failed prank, but this admission was different. An explicit declaration of intent focused on a real person, a blazing red flag of anger and potentially unpredictable violence. I realized he wasn't merely odd, he was manipulating me, distracting me with a lie, then dropping the terrifying truth. He was dangerous. The single, overwhelming thought in my head then was, I have to get out of this dark apartment right now. My heart was pounding wildly in my chest. The unease had vanished, replaced by a bone-deep, icy terror. There was no way I could keep sitting there, pretending that confessing to wanting to kill someone was normal conversation. I shot to my feet, panic and confusion written all over my face. "I'm sorry," I said, desperately trying to steady my voice, "but I really have to go." "It's late." Alex looked at me, that eerie calmness returning to his face. Thankfully, he didn't argue. He agreed to drive me home, and a brief flicker of relief crossed my mind. I thought, great, just a few more steps to the door. I started toward it. But then he spoke again, blocking my way. "Wait," he said evenly, his tone controlled, completely different from the jittery unease earlier. "I want to show you something before we go." Every muscle in my body went rigid. No, I didn't want to see anything else, especially not after what I just heard. Alex walked toward a low cabinet nearby, unlocked it slowly, and pulled out a long, dark object. My blood froze as he turned back around. It was a rifle. He didn't just display it, he held it casually, like an umbrella, and then pointed the barrel directly at me. In that instant, I was utterly paralyzed. In the flickering candlelight, the cold gleam of metal seemed to drain the air from the room. It was pure dominance, a show of power meant to terrify and control, a psychological imprisonment. I let out a small, strangled cry and stumbled back a step, panic written all over me. But Alex stayed unnervingly calm. No smile, no tremor, just standing there, gun leveled, explaining in a flat, almost bored tone that he'd bought it for hunting. Then, as if to erase the horror he'd just created, he added the absurd line, "But I couldn't even imagine killing an animal, let alone a person." Please. That wasn't reassurance. It was cruelty. A man who had just confessed to wanting to kill someone and then pointed a weapon at me wasn't trying to calm me down. He was playing a psychological game. He was testing me, savoring the fear written on my face. It didn't feel like harmless awkwardness. It felt like a predator enjoying the panic of its prey. I took a deep breath, forcing the terror down my throat. "Okay, I see it," I said, keeping my voice from trembling as best I could. "Now, please take me home." Thankfully, he put the gun away, and we left the apartment. The drive back was suffocatingly silent, the tension so thick it felt physical. I sat in the passenger seat, frozen, too afraid to move, or say anything that might change his mind. I just stared straight ahead, counting the seconds until I could feel solid ground beneath my feet again. Finally, he pulled up near my friend's apartment. The moment the car door shut behind me and I stood under the glow of the streetlight, I knew I was safe, but the relief came with a deep, unshakable chill that burrowed straight into my bones. The moment I stepped into my friend's house, everything collapsed. The relief of escaping that dark apartment quickly gave way to uncontrollable trembling. I was safe, but the fear, the raw, lingering terror, was still there. I poured out the whole story in a breathless blur, his rudeness, the isolation of the apartment, the violent confessions, and the final moment, the rifle pointed straight at my face. My friend's reaction, and later everyone else I told, was identical. Pure shock. People stared at me, mouths open, unable to believe it. "Are you sure you're not exaggerating a little?" someone asked. And that question only made me realize just how insane the whole thing had been. My date hadn't just gone badly. It had crossed into something far beyond normal human behavior. The more I retold it, the more I began to see Alex's actions for what they really were. It wasn't the endearing awkwardness of a nervous guy. It was a calculated sequence of red flags, almost like a performance. Total control. By canceling the public picnic and replacing it with his dimly lit, isolated apartment, he made a strategic move to isolate me, to create an immediate imbalance of power. He wanted absolute control, emotional manipulation through violence. He shifted the conversation toward murder and dark secrets, not to build intimacy, but to test boundaries, to shock me, to force a reactions. A power display with a weapon, the final act, pointing the gun at me, was the ultimate manipulation. It wasn't casual bravado, it was psychological domination. He wanted me to know that he could hurt me, and get away with it, no matter how terrified I was. His calm in the face of my fear was the most chilling part. It revealed a total absence of empathy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't just encountered an odd, socially awkward man. My instincts screamed that there was something much darker underneath, a predatory psychology, someone who derived pleasure from control and fear. He had escalated from rudeness to outright physical threat with terrifying speed, and he'd enjoyed every second of it. Even though I was safely home, the experience left me feeling violated, watched. It was as if he'd opened a door into the darkest corner of his mind, and now I couldn't close it. The most horrifying lesson of all was this: the polished exterior of a charming and high-achieving student can hide something utterly cold, dangerous, and monstrous. I had gone on a date and met a predator disguised as a person. This happened a few years ago, but there are memories that never fade. Mine is cold and sharp, like a shard of broken glass lodged in my mind, haunting me to this day. That day, my husband, our son, and I were at a park near our house, a place that, in the summer, buzzes like a beehive, full of children's laughter and the rhythmic footfalls of joggers along the winding stone path circling the lake. Our usual routine was simple. My husband would watch our son at the playground while I took our dog, BB, for a walk. I'd put on my headphones, listen to a podcast, and the miles would pass almost without notice. Normally, the park was packed with people, but that day was different. It was early spring, and the weather couldn't have been less inviting. The sky hung heavy and gray, and the wind coming off the lake still carried the biting chill of winter. It was the kind of cold that seemed to seep into your bones. But I didn't care. After being cooped up for days, I was restless to move, to feel the air again. So was BB. We set off, leaving behind the fading sounds of laughter and playful shrieks from the playground. About 20 minutes later, I noticed something strange in BB's behavior. Normally, he walked right beside me, calm and obedient, but now he was pulling at the leash, not in excitement, but in tension. His posture was rigid, his ears alert. He kept sniffing the air, then glancing nervously over his shoulders. That's when I realized something chilling. We were completely alone. No joggers, no other dog walkers, no teenagers loitering on the benches. Almost alone. Almost. I glanced back. They were there, 2 men, walking behind me, their pace disturbingly fast. There was nothing remarkable about their appearance, just 2 ordinary men in jackets on a cold day. But the speed of their approach, coupled with BB's instinctive unease, sent a jolt of ice through my spine. I tried to brush it off. "Stop it. You're being paranoid again. They're just out for a walk." I slowed down, stepping aside to let them pass. And they did, without a word, without even a glance. The wave of relief that washed over me was almost embarrassing. The irrational fear melted away as their figures grew smaller ahead of me. They were still within sight, far enough that I felt safe, but close enough to watch. I focused on the sound of my footsteps against the stone path, trying to convince myself everything was fine, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that I had just given away the only advantage I had. That fleeting sense of relief lasted only a few short minutes. A fragile calm quickly shattered. I kept my eyes on the 2 men ahead, maintaining a safe distance. Then, suddenly, they stopped. It wasn't the kind of stop people make to rest or tie a shoelace. They stood close together, and the one I'll call Man A leaned in, whispering something into Man B's ear. It was an intensely private, conspiratorial gesture, like a scene straight out of a horror film, where the villain reveals his plan before the trap is sprung. Man B nodded once, sharply, then began walking faster, disappearing around a bend in the path. And Man A, he turned around and started walking back toward me. I tried desperately to rationalize it. Maybe he forgot something. Maybe he wasn't feeling well. Maybe he needed to use the restroom. I grasped at every possible explanation for behavior that, deep down, I knew didn't make sense. Because the truth, that a stranger had suddenly changed direction after a whispered conversation, felt like the setup to something sinister. As man A drew closer, our eyes met for a split second, out of pure social reflex. I smiled and nodded, a meaningless gesture meant to diffuse whatever tension I imagined, and the smile he gave me in return still haunts me to this day. It wasn't friendly, nor embarrassed at being caught staring. It was wide, stretching unnaturally from ear to ear, but it never reached his eyes. Those eyes were hollow, utterly devoid of warmth or humanity. It wasn't a smile at all. It was a mask, and he knew it was about to slip. Looking back, one detail stands out vividly. My dog, BB, my normally gentle and obedient companion, stepped forward on his own, placing himself squarely between me and Man A as the man passed. It wasn't aggression, no barking, no growling, just silent defiance. A living barrier, a warning I could not mistake. I kept walking, but each step grew heavier, more deliberate. I knew, in that moment, I should have turned around, but I didn't. Some foolish pride or stubborn denial kept me moving forward. I didn't want to look afraid. I didn't want to be afraid. I dragged my feet for a few more minutes, pretending everything was normal. I forced myself to focus on the podcast babbling in my ear, to breathe slowly, but it was useless. The sensation of being watched, of being hunted, had swallowed every other thought. I couldn't shake the image of that smile or the way they'd separated with such cold calculation. My gut screamed in silence. This is a trap, a deliberate setup. The distance between me and Man A remained, but it offered no comfort. If anything, it felt like part of the plan, coldly measured. Then a new chill ran down my spine. Man B was gone. My brain scrambled for an explanation. Maybe he'd ducked into the public restroom up ahead. But even that feeble excuse dissolved as quickly as it formed. No one wanders into the restroom without saying a word to their companion, especially not right after that whispering exchange. Now Man B was sitting in a blind spot just ahead of me. The perfect place to appear suddenly, to block my path, to cut off my only escape. As that horrible thought crossed my mind, BB yanked the leash hard. This time, it wasn't anxiety. This was real panic. He planted himself, leash taut, staring back over his shoulder. I spun around, and that's when the real terror hit. Man A was coming at me fast. He wasn't running, exactly, but it was a deliberate, closing in stride, the kind of purposeful pace someone uses to quickly shrink the distance to their prey. It had the urgency of a man racing to a meeting, and his meeting was me. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest. Any attempt at self-reassurance collapsed. There was no longer any doubt. I was being corralled. Man B waited somewhere ahead. Man A was moving in from behind. I couldn't run. Running now would only make me more vulnerable. I knew I had to do something to break this formation, and I had to do it now, before the gap between us closed entirely. I spotted a park bench nearby. The decision came in a flash: face him, and shatter the isolation he was trying to create. Without a moment's hesitation, I rushed toward the bench and dropped onto it, turning to face Man A, head on as he advanced. My plan was simple: take away his advantage of coming up from behind. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone. My clumsy fingers swiped across the screen, found my husband's name, and hit call. The moment the ringing began, I switched to speaker and spoke loudly, my voice shaking but trying desperately to sound steady. "Yes, I'm on my way back now. I'll be there soon." This was my safety act. I wanted Man A to hear, loud and clear, that someone knew where I was, that I was on my way home, and that there was a person who could intervene at any moment. I set the phone on my lap, eyes locked on him, as he kept walking, never slowing. not even for a second, despite my call. He was closing the distance fast, to the point where he'd have to brush right past me. His persistence only confirmed my worst fear. And just as he was about to pass me, the unthinkable happened. BB, my dog, the gentlest creature on earth, the one who'd wag his tail for anyone who so much as scratched his ears, suddenly lunged straight at the man. It wasn't a playful bark. It was a deep, primal growl that tore up from his chest, followed by a sharp, explosive bark that shattered the park's silence. BB was part Norwegian elk hound, so his bark was naturally powerful and resonant. The sudden jolt nearly made me drop my phone. In over 6 years of owning him, BB had never, not once, shown an ounce of aggression. But right then, he became something else entirely, a guardian spirit, hackles raised, eyes wild and locked on Man A.